All right, so I would like to talk to you a little bit about the Civil War today, and more importantly, kind of 10 things that you should know about the Civil War. It was a huge conflict in our country. It was a big part of in shaping what our country looks like today. So, but also it's really important to know, and let's just get into it here. It's really important to know that many people would argue, or maybe you've heard this before, but you know, the idea that the Civil War was fought for more or other reasons than slavery. Yes, I would say that's true, but most importantly, the Civil War was fought for states' rights to have slaves. Okay, so if someone says, "Oh, it was about state rights," you can respond with, "It was about states' rights to own slaves," and that is the main reason, the number one reason the Civil War was fought. Okay, so if you're setting up Cornell notes, you would want to form this as a question. The first thing, what was the number one reason, or what was a reason the Civil War was fought? Or however you want to set that up. Now, you do not need to write these down. You do not need to write all these bullet points down. These are just some interesting ideas about slavery. But the main thing you need to understand was the number one reason, the first reason, and I would argue the main reason the war was fought was over slavery and states' rights to have slaves. Not every state during that time allowed slavery, but the southern states did, and when Lincoln was elected, they rebelled. Okay, some interesting ideas. First slaves, we're kind of in that Jamestown period, that early 1500s, 1600s, there were slaves at Jamestown. Slavery and ethnicity, during the 15th century, the 1400s, this really emerges, okay? African Americans equaled okay to have slaves. Every other ethnicity, not so much. So it tied that being of a certain ethnicity to being a slave. And that wasn't really until the 1400s. So that means that, like, in Rome, or in even in the medieval ages, or in Muslim societies previously, that you could have had, and I'm not sure about how many there may have been, but you could have had slaves that were not of African descent or ethnic African. But this, after about the 1400s, this really becomes prominent. Slavery in the New World, it was a huge, huge part of the New World economy, not just in our United States, but more importantly in South America and in the Caribbean, West Indies. We had a huge, huge population of African Americans, over 12 million people, and during this time of a country of about 60 million, 12 million of the people being slaves. So that's huge, that's very relevant. And slavery. So one thing you should know about the Civil War, and I would write this down, is it's known as the first modern war. So on this column on the side, is known as the first modern war. The reasons that it's known as the first modern war, you had mass amounts of losses of life, okay? You had losses of life in the tens of thousands in a day or a few hours, and that was unheard of previously in warfare. It would have been more likely to have a longer, prolonged conflict over a few days. But this quick kill, or this quick amount of death, and it sounds gruesome, but what do we know happens at the beginning of the 20th century? That's another example of one of the early modern wars. World War Uno, right? Yeah. World War I. And I would argue a lot of the Civil War is a precursor for World War I. New technology that extends some of this quick kills, but also just the overall type of conflict These are some examples of the new technologies that come into play. You have a Gatling gun by the end of the war. You have railroads playing a pretty pivotal role. You have these ironclad ships, they call them. So the first ship's kind of made of iron or steel. So number three, the reason this is known as the first modern war, it's a total war. So especially in the South, you have that slash and burn, that destruction of all property, that burning of homes, businesses, factories that supplied the war, but that idea of total war. And number four, it is a harbinger of things to come. By the end of the war, they are fighting in trenches, and we know that World War I was a huge trench warfare conflict. So by the end of the Civil War, you start to see some of those early indications of what war is going to look like in the 20th century. And it is the largest conflict of the 19th century up until that point. You have the Crimea conflict that is probably considered a little bit bigger and broader, and actually more people perished in, and that's a little bit later after the Civil War. That's in Europe. Questions on this? Why it's known as the first modern war? Number three. Another thing you should know about the Civil War, or a question if you're using an essential question, did the Civil War change our national identity? Yes. Yes. This idea of federalism, working with state, local, but with the feds on top. That idea of federalism emerges out of this conflict. Okay, so you can argue all you want. Why do we have to learn this stuff? But if nothing else, it's important to understand your government, and this is the government that emerges. Some of the examples of this federalist power or this federal power that emerge right from the Civil War are the Homestead Act, railroads, and tying back into the Homestead Act are land grants themselves. So huge amounts of land are distributed as part of this Homestead Act and the land grants. You also see an income tax, a federal income tax emerge from the Civil War. First Federal Reserve or federal banks chartered. Well, not the first, but so recall, kind of, maybe we've had this discussion in here before, but the big thing to remember is that before the Civil War, you would consider yourself, and it's a hard concept to wrap our heads around, but you would consider yourself a citizen of Colorado before you would a citizen of the United States. Now, I've lived in a couple of states. Has anyone else lived in other states in here? Courtney has. Everyone else has only lived in Colorado?
Yeah.
Oh, you have too? So when you consider yourself, do you consider yourself a citizen of Colorado first, or do you consider yourself an American citizen? Just as your own identity. You consider yourself a Coloradan first?
I've only been in Las Vegas for like a year.
I consider myself a citizen of Colorado also.
First?
Yeah.
Like when you think of it?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I consider myself a citizen of New York and
So, American citizen is usually what I would argue most people consider themselves first and foremost. If someone from another country came in here, I would say most of you would probably answer, hey, where are you from? You would answer the United States first. Or if you were in another country, you wouldn't say, I'm a Coloradan from the United States. I'm a United States citizen living in Colorado. But it's important to remember before this, Colorado, or being a citizen of Virginia or South Carolina, and that's this idea of states' rights, guys. That's the whole idea, is that you have the right of your states before your national government. And the Constitution changes after this because of this war and this conflict and this idea.
Northern states also use the states' rights argument to argue for anti-slavery laws, which was not very well respected throughout the South. So both sides were using that argument.
So, Jake, are you with us?
Yeah.
Okay. I see you got your earbuds in. That's all. Number fourth thing you really need to know about the Civil War. It is America's most costly war. Not only in dead, but in actual treasure, bitterness, division, and the massive amounts of wounded individuals that came out of it. So 600,000 killed is more than World War II, it's more than World War I, it's more than Vietnam, it's more than any other, all these other conflicts combined. So 600,000 killed in the Civil War makes it, a kind of a gruesome but costly war in a gruesome way. The South is destroyed. Cities like Atlanta, Richmond, not as much New Orleans. That was spared early in the war, but some of those bigger southern cities, and they are decimated. Basically, I'm going to show you a picture in a second, but they are, that whole idea of slash and burn total war is put into effect on our own country by our own military.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about and consider. Yep, sorry.
The southern states often threw their best and brightest people into that conflict. So their leadership post-Civil War is greatly decimated. Their best and brightest are gone.
Yeah, if you consider 600,000 people today, it would be 6 million. It would be like 6 million people today were killed, because the population of the United States was only about 30 million. Now we're looking at 300 million. And so if you think about 6 million people, it would be very devastating to our whole country. And it was a devastating time to be an American.
Can you please not change it yet?
Okay. This bitterness, this division doesn't go away by the end of the conflict. Groups like the KKK come out of the Civil War and are a direct result of some of the remaining leadership in the Confederacy. Founded the KKK. You also have a huge wounded population.
What is the KKK anyways? I felt like
The Ku Klux Klan,
Okay.
the Klan, those guys with the goofy. Yeah.
People who dress up like ghosts.
Pointy white hats.
Ready?
I know what it is. Yep.
Number 5. It's important to remember how destructive, and this is an actual photo from Atlanta after the armies went through and burned everything, destroyed everything. So this is, and I mentioned this before, a precursor of war to come. World War I, World War II especially. But these cities were gone. There was no one living in them. It wipes out that class structure, rightly so. We mentioned this idea that that there weren't enough people or people with the capabilities in the South. There really weren't. Infrastructure and the reason I mention household is because what happens to a household that loses either the primary income? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a bad thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a bad thing.
They can't maintain it.
Yeah, and this happened all across the South because you have not only the father was dead or wounded, but the brother, the oldest son, the other brother, and they're wounded in not just like physical ways either. So you have a lot of those things that happen, like PTSD. It wasn't really a term back then, but there was certainly a lot of mental health, physical health issues that came out of the Civil War. We're going to talk a little bit about one of the main roles of women in the Civil War in just a second.
Those households were divided. It was brother upon brother, father upon son. I mean, in the same household, you have one person with northern sympathies, another person with southern sympathies fighting each other sometimes in the same battle.
That definitely happened. My brother lives in Virginia right now, so there would be a very good chance that he might fight on the southern side, and I would fight on the northern side, But that is very true. That not only was the entire country divided, but it did divide families. Number 6, it's important to remember African Americans do not, on a whole, and this is kind of interesting to think about, but there are a lot of reasons. Maybe they wanted to leave. Really, they couldn't. If you go from being a slave to being a free person, are you going to have a lot of resources to make a journey 1,000 miles maybe or more? No, right? So that is probably the main reason. It just wasn't possible to get out. And you would think, I want to get the heck away from where I was enslaved, where this horrible institution existed. That was not the case. And on a whole, a lot of those populations remained. Starts out as kind of a good thing until around 1870s. During the 1870s, right after the Civil War, you start to see a rise of politicians of African American descent, even representation in Congress. However, that quickly fades, and you have the 14th Amendment even before that. That's an amendment to the Constitution giving, or not giving, but just really stating that right to vote, that 14th Amendment. It states this, you now have the right to vote. For African American men, ladies, men, not women. It wasn't until 1920 that women received the right to vote constitutionally.
Were there any minorities during this time? Or was it just African Americans?
No, yeah, there would have been Mexican Americans, Native Americans, African Americans, even Chinese Americans starting to. So again, this politics arises in the 1870s. The vote is suppressed through things like Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests that they gave just to vote, and any kind of hope that power was going to go to, the people in the South kind of quickly fades. Another really, really, really terrible thing that emerges is sharecropping. So those same folks that were in chains and being enslaved kind of become a little bit more, the whole idea of sharecropping is this, and I'm going to go really fast. So you have a landowner, then you have the people who work on the land, and then you have this circle of kind of keeping people a little bit trapped in that. So sharecropping basically was you borrowed money to plant your crop, and then if the crop didn't fully turn out, you may or may not could have owed more than what you borrowed. So, long story short, it basically kept people very tied to the land. And it wasn't just African Americans that were sharecroppers, but in the South especially, it was. And it wasn't really until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s that you get explicit rights, finally, in and laws that help people have the right to vote and those civil rights that we all kind of take a little bit of advantage of, I would argue. So that's 100 years. 100 years later. It took another 100 years. And there were many little battles still being fought of the Civil War. This is from 2010. Percentage of Americans living in poverty. I show you this map because hopefully you are seeing where the percentage of poverty in America, where a huge percentage of people, anything in red is 25% of the people living in poverty. So 25% of the people, we're doing okay. We're doing okay. Better than a lot of these places in the South. What it illustrates, though, is, how devastating this conflict really was on everybody. It takes a long time to rebuild a society after a conflict like this. And this is 2010 data, okay?
Has it gone up or down?
Since 2010?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Probably would have gone up a little bit.
Maybe. So you should definitely be aware that at the end, right at the literally months, a few months after, they signed the peace treaty at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln is assassinated. So this is kind of the final action of the Civil War, the final because it was a huge conspiracy involving more than a few people. But John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln at Ford Theater. He jumps out of the presidential booth here, and it's like pretty high up, so he jumps and he hurts his leg, but he runs and he escaped, and he's captured a few weeks later, or a week later. But it's a massive conspiracy.
Was he killed?
And he was killed, yes, and he eventually.
Didn't
But
they just they just put him in a room and then he just died there?
who? Lincoln?
Mhm.
Yeah, Lincoln was brought to a close by hotel or house, and he died shortly thereafter. And the nation really goes into kind of this deep mourning for the president. This is the first time that if you can imagine being an African American and the president who really literally fought a war to have you, and now he's been assassinated, you could very much tie it to the likes of, probably more so even than a Kennedy or a Martin Luther King or those other assassinations of the 20th century.
Through all this going on, when did the slave rebellions happen?
Slave rebellions would have happened previously, and probably not as much during the Civil War. Some, but
So, more before or more
before.
after? Okay.
Well, there weren't any slaves after, theoretically, in the United States. But good question, especially for your paper. I know you're doing. But this is, in my opinion, this is kind of the last act of the Civil War, and there was a pretty widespread conspiracy. The conspirators, a bunch of them are hung. I don't have the picture in there, but there's a hanging. They bring Lincoln's body all the way across the country, which was a pretty big ordeal in those days, by rail. And it takes a few weeks, and he's buried in Springfield, Illinois. He told the citizens of Springfield, Illinois that he would return when he left, when he became president, and he never did. He returned in a casket. So, pretty.
So nice.
Go back to
At least it's still
We
bad.
get to have this bonus.
So, what was interesting to me too is that the more I research the Civil War, because I love the Civil War, I'm actually next week going to be at the Gettysburg Memorial. I'm really excited about
really?
going to Gettysburg on the East Coast for my vacation. But young people are swept up into this war. The more I look into it, over 20% of the of all the soldiers on both sides were your age, so under 18, 25%. Officially, you had to be 18 or over still to fight in the Army, but they didn't have a lot of official record keeping. If you look at this picture, does this guy look about your age?
Yes.
Yeah, he does. He looks like any one of your, and there are a lot of really good diary entries and correspondence that happen with young people. Not only men though, women and young people in general are swept up into this conflict. And everywhere across the country, you really see how influential and how important they were to the overall conflict and what was going on. And they fight alongside. I just want you to note, one of the main reasons they went to fight, for the males especially, was to fight alongside their father, their brothers, or even avenge some of their fathers and brothers. Remember, this is a 4-year conflict, right? So a lot can happen in 4 years. Got it?
That's it.
2 more. So this is an example of a woman who fought in the Civil War. I thought it was really interesting. They show her a picture of her, and then they have her war picture. Her name was Sarah Edmonds. She served 2 years in the 2nd Michigan Infantry as Franklin Thompson. And there's a picture of him. This happened more than people really even realized at first. This happened quite a bit. Women would pose as men to fight in the war, either maybe to be with their husbands, maybe to, again, avenge a husband, even just to, further, they had very strong feelings on both sides. The other way that women served was in the nursing corps, and this really establishes nursing as a profession, this conflict in the United States. So if I have any future health professionals, it's interesting to note that nursing is established kind of as, even this idea that nurses are typically women, that we're totally changing now. I mean, there's plenty of male nurses now. But even this idea that a nurse is kind of a female profession, that comes out of the Civil War. They fought as soldiers, clerks, they did supplies. Women were everywhere in this conflict. We do still, it's important to realize that women weren't making the history. We've talked about this before. They were kind of the people not getting stories written about them in the paper or pictures taken, but they were there. They were a huge part of the conflict, especially in the nursing corps and the following the conflict. They were very important too, especially if you got your leg blown off or something. Right, Tim? It's good to have a good nurse if you got your leg blown off.
Get stoned.
You would have had, didn't they call them camp ladies as well? Prostitutes who would have followed the armies as well.
Squad? Wait, escort?
Yeah, and that term hooker, has anyone heard that? Hooker?
Yeah.
Sometimes we call it hooker. There was a general in the Union Army called Joseph Hooker, and that term arose from the ladies that would follow the conflict there. So they were hookers, ladies, or a hooker. That's where that word comes from.
Can't wait to tell your mom about that when you go home.
All right, the last thing I want everybody to realize about this war, and even though I definitely modern and newer things like railroads, machine guns, all of even the telegraph, those were big factors. But it's important to remember this was not a very modern war, actually. It was used, a revolver, very rarely. Most soldiers carried a smooth bore musket that took, and we talked about this, 60, 90 minutes to load, or minutes, seconds. So it wasn't used that much. Railroads were used, and many of the battles were fought over those railroad junctions, but you still had to move an army by horse and mules. What's interesting to me is that only about 100,000 from each side were actually killed by bullets. Disease and infection kill the other 450 or 400,000 men. So you had this huge, misunderstanding, whatever it was not a modern, you didn't have the same kind of modern medicine that we do to prevent disease, infection, all of that. So more disease than bullets killed people in the Civil War. And especially if we look at some of those early pictures, and you guys have probably, I've heard you all talk about this, what a bunch of idiots, like walking at each other in columns and just shooting at each other, right? We saw that in the American Revolution. We saw that in Napoleon's wars. And we saw it still in the Civil War. That was primarily the way they fought, was they would just have columns of men and walk towards each other, and then a volley. But it does start to change, especially by the end of the conflict. I talked about trench warfare and the like. So, hopefully you took some good notes. I'll leave this one up for a second, but I'm going to launch a Socratic quiz. You have 7 questions. You can use your notes. Don't use your neighbors. You can take it twice if you need to, so see how you do. I'm going to launch it here, so let's take that quiz really quick. And here's my last name.
Is it on the...
No. I haven't launched it yet, so hang on. I got to launch it. But it's on Socrative. You should have the app. If you don't have the app, you can access it through your phones. Whatever.
Wait, where they at? Go.
Wait, what?
Where they at? Go.
Damn.
Where they at? Where they at? Go. Oh, okay. We get them first. Nope, that's not mid. I'm there right now. Just kidding. We're using